good to see everyone here. I know we have multiple churches represented. It's always good to see different churches getting together. Very good to see young people here. As I've been praying for this conference, I have been especially thinking of our young people, because I do think in this day and age it almost seems unfair, the seductiveness of the culture, the seductiveness of the worldview, the pressure that's put on our young people to seduce them into ideologies that a lot of times they don't even know are ideologies. And so a conference like this, I think one of the great values of it is it really connects the dots, okay? We're in this messed up situation, or this is the way we're thinking, but how did we actually get to the place that we are at? And so I would encourage you, if you're grandparents or you have some sort of sway over a young person, you have their ear, think about the different sessions that you're going to hear today, and just maybe think of one or two that really captures your attention, really clarifies things for you, and then that grandchild or whoever it might be, say, hey, would you listen to this? And let's get together and talk about it. Tell me what you think. Because I think it's so important, especially for our young people, to understand the worldview that is informing the cultural mindset in this day and age. So my job this morning, right now, for the next 25 minutes or so, is just to introduce the conference and to introduce you to the main speakers. So I basically want to answer the question, how did we arrive at the cultural confusion that we're in? And I'm really going to focus on the enemies of the truth. I'm going to focus on about 5 philosophers that are going to be talked about today, and what they did in their philosophy to contribute to the cultural confusion. Then the other speakers are going to talk about the men of God, the heroes of the faith that sort of came, either contemporaries or came about and pushed back against these worldly philosophies. So the way I want to do this is I want to start by, oh good, my clicker works. I want to start by introducing you to 4 statements that if these 4 statements had been said within the first 1900 years AD, people would have thought that you lost your mind. Like, that is an insane statement. Why would you say something like that? But if you say these statements in this day and age, outside of the biblical worldview, nobody's going to bat an eye. So listen to these statements. The first one, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. Now, you hear that statement outside the Christian worldview, and today that's totally acceptable. Now, homosexuality obviously has been around for a very long time, but not the idea that you can choose your gender. You could go back to Plato, and you could read these famous quotes by Plato where he talks about soldiers in the Grecian army and how they even had these lifelong homosexual relationships. But if a Greek soldier prior to battle were to stand up and say, I want you men to know that I am actually a woman trapped in a man's body, he would be laughed off the battlefield. Well, that's crazy. Like, it's one thing to talk about homosexuality, it's another thing to say that you can just sort of paint by number, select whatever you think you want to be. And in order for that to be an acceptable statement, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, the only way for people to not bat an eye is if everyone in the room thinks, well, whatever your mindset is, whatever your psyche thinks, whatever your sort of emotional impression or self-perception is, that is ultimate authority. And if that's the ultimate authority, well then of course you can be a woman trapped in a man's body or whatever it might be, because what you think about yourself is ultimate authority. That's the only way that statement is not weird, is if everyone in the room accepts that perception of self is the ultimate authority in the room. Next statement, I feel that your argument is wrong. Now, everybody says that now. I even catch my daughter saying it. Where did you learn that? But it's totally normal. I feel that. Now think about it. You're on the Areopagus. You're listening to the philosophers pontificate. And one philosopher begins to say, I'm a monist. I believe everything comes from water. And you're listening to that. Everything comes from water. You kind of raise your hand. I feel your argument is wrong. Well, why do you feel my argument is wrong? I don't know. makes me feel uncomfortable. And does fire come from water? I mean, I don't know. I just get awkward when you start talking about it. I feel like I need a safe place, and I don't know. And you get through kind of explaining how they make you feel uncomfortable. And at a certain point, if somebody figures out you really disagree with the argument on the grounds of how you feel, how it makes you feel, well, what would happen? You'd be laughed off the Areopagus. The only way for something like that to be totally legit is everybody in the room believes that your feelings and my feelings, subjective impressions, are the weightiest thing in the room, are the most authoritative standard by which we live. Now, if you think that's a bit of an extreme example, just think back no further than Bostock versus Clayton County 2020, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act historically, the Civil Rights Act has protected racial minorities in the workplace, women, like biological women, but they ruled that now it protects anyone based on who they feel they are. So now you have a Civil Rights Act that has been ruled by the Supreme Court to honor a person's perception of self, even if it's not rooted in fact, not rooted in science, not rooted in biology, it's just their emotional perception. So if you think making arguments based upon how you feel is an extreme example, just remember Bostock versus Clayton County, okay? And again, the only way that can be normal is if the mind, the subjective impression, is the ultimate authority. Let's take another statement. I got a divorce because I felt like marriage didn't let me be me. Now, if you said that today, you'd get a standing ovation. You might get a congratulations on your divorce card. But the only reason why that statement isn't crazy is if your quest to be you is the ultimate authority. Your self-expression, self-discovery, authenticity to yourself is more important than the sacred bonds of marriage, more important than being a parent, more important than community relationship. If the quest to be you is the ultimate authority, well, then you can say, of course I'm getting a divorce to discover who I truly am. That only works in a society, again, where the mind and subjective personal impression is the ultimate authority. Let's take a final statement. I chose my church because of the amazing worship experience. Now, some might say, how'd that statement get up there? That's a totally normal statement, right? Well, again, let's go back in time. Imagine you're talking to John Calvin. You say, John Calvin, I like your church. Everything's great, but have you been up to Switzerland? Have you seen Zwingli's church? I mean, the experience is just off the chain, you know. The experience is just so exhilarating. So it's a much better church, a much more authentic church, and that's why I'm going. And John Calvin might say, are you okay? Like, what does an exhilarating experience have to do with absolute truth? What is an exhilarating experience? I mean, I could go bungee jumping and have the most exhilarating experience in the world. Does that make it a more authentic worship experience than corporate worship with the body of Christ? So help me connect the dots here. What does your experience have to do with sound doctrine and absolute truth? And that's the way that not too long ago people would have thought. If we started measuring the health of church worship service based upon a subjective experience that was given to us. But in this day and age, it makes total sense. Why does it make sense? Because personal experience, personal impression is the ultimate standard and the ultimate authority. So the question is, what has happened that these four statements are normal now, but were almost crazy 2 seconds ago? And the answer is simply that self has become the ultimate arbiter of truth. Now, for 2,300 years, we've been saying things like, man is the measure of all things. But we have had Western civilization to temper those kind of man-centered statements to realize you can't really live that out because there is a holy God above and there is a moral absolute after all. So these kind of things have been tempered to some degree. but I think what we're seeing now is self being the ultimate reference point and people living it out in a more shameless way on a societal level than ever before. We've always had the crazy individuals or the crazy movements, but as sort of par for the course in broad society, we're seeing that absolutely lived out. So how did we get to this point? How do we get to this point where we can say crazy statements like that, we can think crazy thoughts, and the world just says, totally legit, because what you think is ultimate authority. And so let me just run you through these particular philosophers that are going to be unpacked by our particular speakers. But what I want to do with each of these philosophers is just to simplify their arguments and simplify what they believed, I want to boil it down to two things. One, I want to tell you who they believe we're made in the image of. Now, they might not use that terminology. That's biblical terminology. We're made in the image of God. But to say we're made in the image of God strikes at our identity. So I want to tell you, each of these philosophers, what they think our identity is. So I'm going to tell you who we're made in the image of. And I want to tell you what they think the gospel is. So we as Bible-believing Christians, we understand the gospel. But they have a good news of liberation too. They think there's a problem. They have their societal problem, and then they posit their gospel solution. So we're going to talk about that. So the first guy up to bat is Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. Jacques Rousseau said, we're made in the image of self. You read that? We're made in the image of self. So we are literally our own reference point for moral order, moral law. And his gospel is, unleash your most primitive passions and you will be free. Okay, so that is where the gospel, that's where liberation lies. So when you think of the Enlightenment, the first person who should come to your mind should be Rousseau. Because there is a sense in which everyone who came after him was Rousseauian. They just put a different spin on Rousseau. But Rousseau, the philosophy that we're going to talk about very briefly, sort of set the stage for all the other thinkers. And you have to understand the era in which Rousseau lived and spoke during that time. While obviously not everyone in Western civilization was born again, about everyone in Western civilization understood, because of the Judeo-Christian ethic, that there is a holy God above, and we are accountable to this holy God. Even if they lived out wicked lives, they understood this is wicked because there's a holy God above, and we are accountable. And they understood that right and wrong has as its reference point God. God is the reference point for right and wrong. If I were to say in this era, no, I am the reference point for right and wrong, I might as well say, I am omnipresent. I am omniscient. I can drive God's omnis. To claim to be the reference point for right and wrong was like taking upon oneself an attribute of God. It was absolutely insane to say that. And it's called moral insanity. And Rousseau stepped up, and that's exactly what he said with his concept of the noble savage. He said, we are our own moral reference point, and true freedom, true authenticity lies not in conforming to God's standard, but in conforming to self. In living out your most base, primitive passions in what he called, in what he called the noble savage. And he truly believed the more we lived out our base, primitive passions, the more noble of people we would be. And then he looked around at society and he said, it's the church that holds us back from living out those innermost passions, our innermost instincts and cravings. It's family that holds us back. It's the laws of the land. And if all these restraints were lifted, we would actually be a better people. And so he famously said, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. We're born just fine. And then society puts laws and restraints and, informs our conscience and things like that and messes us up. Now think about that statement. That sounds like the opposite of what Jesus said. Does Jesus say, yes, we're born free and everywhere no, he says we're born dead and you need deliverance through me. But this is how Rousseau thought of the world. And Rousseau did not think of himself as introducing chaos. He literally believed if we could throw off societal restraints, we would be a more noble people. In fact, Rousseau said, human beings are like wind chimes. Not like guitars. Guitars, you have to stretch the strings, and if you want to play it, well, you have to put your fingers just right, and it takes a lot of force and conformity. And no, we're like wind chimes. You just hang us on your front porch, and you let the winds of nature just blow through you, and it will all by itself make a beautiful sound. So imagine that. Imagine thinking that. And so that was Rousseau. And he said, just one quote, he said, "All I need to do, as I have done up until now, is to look inside myself." Now, you can watch a good Disney movie and hear that lyric now. You just imagine the princess right now, spinning and singing, "Look inside yourself." But in Rousseau's day, nobody talked that way. Like, that was a revolutionary bombshell thought to think that truth is found within you. Next, and all these philosophers, they're building on one another. We're going in chronological order through the Enlightenment. Then you come to Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. And Darwin said, our identity is we're made in the image of brute beasts. We're animals, after all. And his gospel was anything can be justified in the name of next level evolution, which is the basis of evolution. What does it take to survive? What does it take to evolve? What it takes to get to that next level? Liberation is eliminate any obstacle that gets in the way of that next level evolution. So while Rousseau successfully made man the reference point for morality, everybody still realized, well, God made us. So there's this looming reality, how can we be our own reference point if God made us? You still got that God problem, And Darwin comes along, and Darwin creates this fairy tale where life can exist without God. And if life exists without God, well, there goes our moral reference point, and that changes the whole game when it comes to morality. So Darwin produces a fairy tale world where art exists without an artist, law without a lawgiver, design without a designer, life from non-life, and being from non-being. So once you get rid of God, you also get rid of moral absolutes. And now within Darwinism, you have this huge moral vacuum. All right, what constitutes right and wrong? I mean, what's our reference point from this point forward? And so Darwin said, well, that's okay because morality was never given by God anyways. Morality evolved like the finch's beak. And all we have, morality, essentially social taboos and rules and things like this that were purely created for survival purposes. Purely created just to keep us from killing each other. So he makes morality pragmatic. He makes morality, it depends on the situation. It depends on the greater good. Situational ethics, which we know is a great way, sarcastically speaking, to run the world. And so that's how he explained morality. But he creates this moral vacuum, and we know that nature abhors a vacuum, so he creates this moral vacuum. So now that there's no more God and no more standard for right and wrong, now you have all the philosophical offspring of Darwinism that start to step into the vacuum. And you start to have race categories became very popular, where some ethnicities evolved higher than other ethnicities. And, people like Hitler really liked those kind of race categories. So you have, Thomas Malthus and Malthusianism, and you have the whole eugenicist idea where genetically weak people are holding us back, so we need to weed out genetically weak people. So that's the new moral standard, is get rid of genetically weak people. And if you remember some of your history, some strange laws began to be passed where some people were required to be sterilized because there was too much, hereditary weakness within their lineage. And all these horrible things began to come out because people are literally creating their own moral system now. You don't have everyone's made in the image of God. It doesn't matter if you're genetically weak or strong, you're equally valuable. You don't have that anymore. So you have all these philosophies stepping in. You have Marxism, that believes you can only get to next level evolution by deconstructing and destroying and, criticizing. We have all the critical race theories, critical this, critical that. You criticize, deconstruct, and it's only upon the demolition, only upon the ashes and the ruins and the bloodshed, then you can construct whatever next level you need. So you have all these new moral standards. A lot of these 1800s philosophies are just new moral standards, new standards by which we can evaluate human behavior. So the bottom line with Darwinism is he removed the need for God, which liberated man from any moral obligation in his pursuit of next level evolution and his pursuit of Rousseau's noble savage, ultimate self-expression. That's where liberty is. And then comes Frederick Nietzsche, and for time's sake, I'm just going to make a couple comments about him. But he writes and he talks towards the end of the Enlightenment period. So think of Nietzsche as coming after Rousseau, after Darwin, and he's reading their books and he's reading their information, he's building upon their philosophy, and he's from 1844 to 1900. And Nietzsche, similar to Darwin, says, we are made in the image of the super race. Okay, that's our real identity, is the Ubermensch, the Superman, who we want to become. No more restraints and religion and all that holding us back. That's our new identity. And the gospel is, like Darwin, destroy anything that gets in the way. And for time's sake, this is all I'll say. Nietzsche was actually, especially if you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he was actually terrified of a future without God. He talks about embarking into the unknown. There's no moral compass anymore. We don't know what's up. We don't know what's down. We have no reference point. But then he says, what do we need to do? We need to bravely forge ahead. We have to go forward into the unknown because, after all, we are the new enlightened people, and we have to create our own morality, much like an artist who has a blank canvas. We've gotten rid of God, gotten rid of, the need for family and all these other, ball and chain restraints. Now we've got this nice, clean canvas, and we can paint our own morality. We can call the shots. And yes, it's scary, he admitted, but let's be the Superman. We can forge ahead, and we can do this. Very brave of him, so he thought. And then you have Karl Marx. Karl Marx comes 1818 to 1883. And Karl Marx, of course, I think in our day and age, we know more about Marx than all the other previous generations because of what's going on in our society. But he essentially says we're made in the image of the state. The state is either God or the devil. The state either gives you life or takes your life. But whatever it is, all authority, all power goes to the state. So Marx agreed with Rousseau that self-expression, the noble savage, self-expression is absolutely ultimate, but he said only the state can give you the ultimate. Self-expression is the ultimate, but it's only the state that can give it to you. So either the state's depriving you of it and you're the ultimate victim, or the state's giving it to you and you're their ultimate creation. But make no mistake about it, you are the product of the state, of the economy, of the government. You are the product. So if you have a fair economy, you'll have a good, upright civilization. If you have an unjust economy, you will have an evil people and a corrupt people. You will literally not be any better than what the state gives you and what the state allows you to be. And then within Marx, which is a common denominator with a lot of these guys, they viewed religion, they viewed family, they viewed marriage as branches of the state meant to oppress and meant to control you. And what's scary about Marxism is that within Marxism, there is no pre-political. Now, in Genesis, there's a pre-political. Marriage comes in Genesis 2, government comes in Genesis 9. But within Marxism, marriage comes from the government. Family comes from the government. Religion comes from the government. Creates everything. And everything is just a tentacle of the government meant to colonize your brain and oppress you and corrupt you, or grant you life, grant you identity, grant you meaning, but whatever you need, whatever you must be, is granted by the state. If the state sets you free, you shall be free indeed. Now imagine thinking that way. And sometimes Christians slump into this. The way we talk about politics is almost like, if only the government would change, then everything would be so much better. Sometimes we put way too much hope in changing the system in the government. But here's one of the implications. If the highest meaning is self-expression, and only the government can give that to you, that means for the rest of your life, you will either be a broken victim, I am broken, I'm messed up because of what the government has done, or you're going to be a wild-eyed activist the rest of your life trying to change the government because the only hope is in the government. So you're either going to be a victim, or you're either going to devote your life to changing a system that we know doesn't really have a reputation for changing that much. And you're stuck there. That's the hopeless world of Marxism. And then lastly, and very importantly, is Sigmund Freud. 1856 to 1939, Sigmund Freud said, "We are made in the image of sex." The gospel is sexual liberation. So whether it's your sex drive, any sexual inclinations, sexual passions, sexual orientation, giving full expression to that is your true identity. So Freud took Rousseau's idea that self-expression is ultimate, and he said, amen to that, but when you say self-expression, I say sexual expression. Because the way Freud looked at the world is that good and evil are measured by pleasure and pain. So the greatest pain is the greatest evil, the greatest pleasure is the greatest good, and because he didn't know God, sex is the greatest pleasure, therefore sex is the greatest good, so society needs to back off, parents and family and churches need to back off restraining sexual expression, because if only we had a world where everyone could just express literally anything they wanted, all the time, no matter what age, then we would have a liberated society. And once again, he saw state, family, religion, marriage as arms of suppression for the state. I think Wilhelm Reich, do I have the quote there? Yeah. One of his disciples said this, morality's aim, so listen to this, morality, what's the goal of morality? Morality's aim is to produce acquiescent subjects who, despite distress and humiliation, are adjusted to the authoritarian order. Thus, the family is the authoritarian state in miniature. The oppressive government? Yeah, families, a mini government meant to suppress you, in which the child must learn to adapt himself as a preparation for the general social adjustment required of him later. So this is Freud just constantly teaching, who, by the way, was very popular amongst the youth generation, big shocker. Just constantly pushing, you're being sexually oppressed, you're being sexually oppressed. And as the youth generation is sort of coming to realize that, coinciding with that is the legalization of abortion, mass access to contraception, and so suddenly technology permits them to fully express themselves sexually and cut themselves from the ball and chain that's holding them back from being the noble savage that Rousseau wanted in the beginning. And we sometimes think of the 60s and all that, but this started long before that. Technology just made it possible for the 60s to be what they were. So I think it's important to note that we're not just witnessing the lowering of a standard. Sometimes we talk about that. Wow, the standard's really getting lowered. No, this is a brand new worldview. It's a brand new worldview where it says self, not God, is the ultimate authority. And now we're being given permission to live out whatever our self and whatever our passions believe. And so that is why I think if you connect all these dots, you start with that insane, gutsy thing Rousseau said, ultimate authenticity is living out yourself, and then how all the philosophers came along and sort of put their spin and put their the practical steps to getting there, then you can understand why in our present day and age you can say things like, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. And it's not weird anymore, because self is the ultimate arbiter of truth. I think the summary is while the highest moral good is the full expression of our inner self and moral restraints, and you think about that, you hear that in the society. Moral restraints that are good gifts from God have now become the enemy. So think about this verse as I close, 2 Corinthians 10:5. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Because what the church needs to do is to look at the way people think, trace the philosophies, the ideologies behind them, and expose them under the bright sunlight of God's Word. This is the motivation behind them. This is the impetus behind them. And then, not just to call it out, because sometimes we're good at saying what's wrong, but then to go back and say, well, what's the truth? The truth is, we're made in the image of God. And that is wonderful, marvelous, good news. And the gospel is that Christ has died for his image bearers, so that if we repent and put our faith in Christ, we are saved and we are restored to our created purpose. That's the worldview that we articulate, and that's the worldview that we push back against with.